Right, we are live on Facebook now. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the VMA virtual platform. This afternoon, we have an expert talk from Dr. Kieran Walsh. Walsh is the clinical director at BMJ, and this afternoon, he is going to tell us all about how to get published. The actual talk is about 35 minutes or so, give or take. Then we will take questions from the audience, both on Zoom and on Facebook. So for the audience Zoom, as usual, you can use the raise hand function if you want to actually interact, or you can drop your questions on the chat or the Q&A box. And as always, for Facebook audience, you can just drop your questions on the chat box and we'll catch up with them later. Over to you, Kieran.
Thank you very much, Asmi. Lovely to be back again, talking to you and colleagues. As Asmi says, please do interact, ask questions, use the chat. Be really interested to hear your questions and comments, and we'll do our best to get through all of them. I'm just going to share my screen now, so you should be able to see my slide now. It's gone directly to my slide. Asmi, can you see my slide?
Yes, I can see your slides, Kieran.
Fantastic, thank you. So as Asmi said, I'm going to give a brief talk on how to write a paper that editors will want to publish. And before I dive in, I just want to kind of open up by asking why get published in the first places. That there's lots of potential reasons. They're all listed here, from saying something important through to educate, change practice. I won't read them all out, but often in a high impact journal, changing practice, changing the clinical practice or public health practice of healthcare professionals is really, really important and will stand out. What do editors then want, if that's why you want to get published? They want lots of different things. They want work that's important, obviously. They expect as a minimum truth and transparency and any competing interests declared. Once again, potential to improve decision-making, change clinical practice is important. They want work that's original, if at all possible, that's relevant to their audience. And it's important when picking your journal that you think about that. Is it a general medical journal or that your work is relevant to, or is it more of a specialist journal? And also, of course, they want the wow factor, a paper that will be a real game changer. But I wouldn't worry too much about that, because the wow factor only comes along every now and again. Just worry mainly about getting the basics right. And to kind of boil down or to edit the basics, what are they? That they want, editors will want work that's original. And original is difficult because it's hard to think of work that's completely original. But do think about how your work might be the first in this setting, or in this country, or in primary care, or whatever. There should be some way in which you can say that your work is original. Obviously, that work is important. And obviously that work is academically rigorous. And we'll go into that in more detail in a second, but that will come to the detail that you put into your methodology. If you can, that the work is topical. The obvious example over the past 2 years being COVID. And if your work is related to COVID, then journals will undoubtedly be interested, and they'll be interested in seeing if they can publish it reasonably quickly. Depending on the journal may be an international journal, in which case you need to make clear why your paper is important, not just in England or within the UK, but of interest in lots of different countries. And also, once again, depending on the journal, but many of the high impact journals are generalist medical journals. And so you need to demonstrate why this work is important to general practitioners or general internal medics or public health doctors, those who work in population health. But even more important to get published is you need to write up your work and submit it to a journal. It seems obvious, but there's a film from a few years ago called Throw Mama from the Train, and there's a mantra in the film which is a writer writes. I see people all the time who have great ideas, but who don't have time or inclination or energy to write them down and to submit them to a journal. And of course, they won't get published. So you need to take that vitally important step. And planning is all important as well, and indeed is the first step. And you need to plan from the start. And we'll be concentrating on the traditional research in this talk, which usually follows the IMRAD structure, i.e. introductions, methodology, etc., etc. And I always say to people that you can start your article before you finish your research, sometimes before you start it, because if you're doing research, then you'll have to write up a protocol which will have an introduction, and you'll have to write up your methodology. And those things shouldn't change and won't change as you work through your research. So you might as well get going on them from the start. And too often I meet people who are doing PhDs or MDs and they leave all the writing to the very end and sometimes run out of time. And I think that's a missed opportunity. And there's no need to do that. You can start writing as you start your research. The basics are really important: to read the journal, to read the instructions for authors, and read them really carefully and follow them. And if there's anything unclear, to ask the office. If you don't follow the instructions for authors in certain high impact journals, you'll end up in the rapid reject zone. If your paper's abstract is in the wrong format or too long, or you don't follow the basic instructions that the journal is telling you, then you won't get as far as peer review. So you need really to go to instructions for authors and read them really carefully. And in doing so, you'll be choosing the format of your paper. And there's lots of different formats. I won't read these all out, but of course, papers don't have to be research. And the principles are the same. And often I give this talk to people who are starting off in their research careers, who are junior doctors. And I always say to them, you don't need to start off with a meta-analysis or randomized controlled trials. You can start off with something much more simple, like a case report or a quality improvement report, and develop experience over time. But the thing is, make sure that you do a good job of your case report or a quality improvement report. And then you'll be able to build up experience and build up to doing something like a meta-analysis or a randomized controlled trial. And it's important to put yourself in the position of the editor, because the editor will look at certain things and in a certain order. And this is important because the editor will often look at things that you're not expecting. Obviously, they'll look at the title first and the abstract, but also the cover letter is really important as well. And if they like what they see on those three, they'll go on to read the rest of your paper. But important to remember these things, i.e. title, abstract, cover letter, and give a little bit of thought to them. Often journals will have a style for titles, and here are some styles. it's important to follow them, and sometimes they'll be in the instructions for authors. Sometimes you'll just know the style from reading other papers in the journal. But the thing is to follow the journal's style and give a little bit of thought to it, because it'll be the first thing that the editor will see. And too often people don't give any thought to it, and they just put together a title, and then they find out the title is too long and they cut it without giving sufficient thought to it. And because it makes a good first impression, you should make sure that it is as good as it can possibly be. The cover letter is probably the most neglected one. Do read the instructions for authors, and then when writing your cover letter, try and say to the editor that you're giving them something that they will want. So state in your cover letter that your work is original, or how it's original, if it is, that it's important in whatever way, that you use the right methodology and you used it rigorously. And if it's topical or of international importance or relevant to a generalist, do say those things as well. And do spend time on it. It's a missed opportunity if you leave it blank or say, please find attached. It's a small opportunity to push your paper, not too much, but just a little bit. And then, of course, your abstract. And once again, there'll be instructions for authors for the abstract, usually a limited word count, anything from 250 to 400 words. Once again, spend time on it, follow the suggested structure. And I know I'm emphasizing this, but I really can't overemphasize it enough. Often journals will screen papers that come in on title and abstract and cover letter, and if the editors like what they see, they'll go on and continue to read the rest of the paper. But if they don't, they may not. So it's worthwhile making that first impression, because sometimes it'll be the only part of the study that will be read. And different journals have different structures, suggested structures for the abstract, or required structures for the abstract. Sometimes it's a very simple IMRAD structure: introductions, methods, results, discussion. Sometimes it's in this much more structured format. It doesn't matter what the format is. I'm not saying one is better than another, but just follow the suggested structure of the journal. And throughout this talk, I'm going to mention various resources that may be helpful to you in getting your research published. One is BMJ Research to Publication, which is an online digital resource that takes you through everything you need to get published, from the very first steps of planning your research through to choosing the methodology, through to choosing the journal, navigating peer review, etc., etc. So that's just one resource. And one resource of many that I'll be mentioning. Another resource that can be really helpful is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors Guidance. It's all freely available if you Google it, and there's a wealth of information there. Which you'll find helpful no matter what type of paper you're submitting. And let's move on to the next stage, which is actually writing up your paper. And we're assuming that this is research and it's in the IMRAD structure, i.e. introductions, methods, results, discussion. So we're going to go through each one of these one by one, very briefly. But introduction should be only a few paragraphs, and be careful not to go over the word limit, because you can write lots and lots and lots potentially. Keep it brief. Write what's known and not known on the research question, and then in the last paragraph and of the introduction, restate clearly what the research question is and why the research question matters, and then move on. Next in is the methodology, which is a bit like a recipe. And of course, it's the most important section for informed readers. One important tip is to follow reporting guidelines. One example being the consort statement or consort criteria for randomized controlled trials, and more about those in a second. Describe measures to ensure that you that you followed ethical conduct, which may relate to consent or confidentiality or whatever, and fully describe and indeed give references for the laboratory or statistical methods that you might use. Try and write up your methodology in a format that the editor will recognize and therefore be reassured by. From one such format is, of course, the PICO elements. So which patients, which intervention or exposure, which comparison group, and then what outcomes or endpoints did you aim to reach? A common question that I get asked is, well, what type of study design is best or most likely to get published or editors most interested in? And of course, there's lots of different study designs. I'm not going to go through them in any detail because we just don't have time, but suffice to say that editors expect the study design to be the best for answering the particular research question, and that you justify your choice of study design in your methodology. So you should do that. I mentioned a little bit about reporting guidelines. This is the Equator Network. Lots of people will be familiar with. It's a compendium of international reporting guidelines. Any type of paper, you'll find a reporting guideline on it. Do check it and make sure that you write up your paper in line with it. It's all freely available on the Equator Network. Sometimes it's translated. Sometimes there's a flowchart associated with it, and indeed a checklist. And sometimes you're required, when submitting your paper, to submit the checklist alongside it to be explicit how you followed the reporting guidelines. And the editor will be reassured when they see in the methodology that you followed the relevant reporting guidelines. And everybody knows criteria and Prisma, but there's a range of different reporting guidelines, such as Squire guidelines for writing up a quality improvement report. There's going back, there's Cheers guidelines for economic evaluations. There's even guidelines for writing up case reports, care guidelines. So do look at them, and you'll find them very useful. An important tip is to look at these things not just when writing up your study, but actually before you start your study. Because too often, once again, I meet people who are writing up their paper and then discover things that they've missed out at the very end, and it's too late and they can't go back. So you can find out all these things before you even start, and that will really, really help you at the end when it comes to writing up. This is another example of free resources on statistics. I should say, if anybody wants the slide, let me know. I'll put my email address at the very end. In the methodology, and I know I'm going on a lot about methodology, but it's really important and the most important section for informed readers. But you need to describe the ethical aspects of your methodology, from consent, deviation from normal practice, burden imposed on patients, risks and benefits to participants, benefit to society, confidentiality, privacy, etc., etc. So that's methodology, and then quickly moving on to results. And of course, you need to report the results fully and honestly and completely, and use different formats where relevant, including text, tables, and figures, which should complement each other and add value. There's no point in putting in figures unless it does actually add something to telling the story of your results. Report primary outcomes first and put most emphasis on primary outcomes, and leave out non-essential numbers. Report essential summary statistics, and don't put too much emphasis on secondary outcomes. Concentrate on the primary outcomes. An important error or pitfall here is sometimes to start the discussion or to interpret the results in the results section. Don't do that. Wait, because you'll have a chance when you get to the discussion. And when you get to discussion, this is what you should do. Restate briefly the principal findings. Point out the strengths and weaknesses of the study. And point out the strengths and weaknesses in relation to other studies, because no study is perfect. But if your study has certain strengths where other studies have weaknesses, then it could add an important piece to the jigsaw of the evidence base, and that will increase your chances of getting published. Do mention possible mechanisms and explanations, potential implications, unanswered questions, but go easy on these last three and don't get carried away, because essentially there's a degree of speculation in all of them. We don't really know. We can't say for certain why you got the findings, definitely what the implications might be, but what you can point out strengths and weaknesses in relation to other studies, so do concentrate on those. The BMJ requires what this paper adds box, whereby you state what's already known on the subject and what the study adds. And here's a slide on treatment trials that the BMJ prioritizes, but I'm going to move on quickly from that. And really important section on authorship, and I regularly get asked about authorship. Who should be an author? Who should not be an author? And the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors recommends that authorship is based on the following 4 criteria: substantial contributions to the conception, design, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation, and drafting or revising critically, and final approval, and agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. And an important point there is all those ands. So if you help to draft or to revise the paper and didn't do anything else, that's not enough to be an author. You need to meet all these criteria. Maybe you can be a contributor. And if you meet all these criteria, you should be an author. And if you don't, you should not be. To avoid problems with authorship, it's probably best to establish a group of authors before you start and agree what will qualify as substantial and agree who's going to be the first author, etc., in the order of the authorship before you start, and you're likely to avoid running into problems at the end. A few points about clear writing. Use plain English, short words, simple sentences, active voice. Avoid metaphors, similes, figures of speech. Use simple, plain English. So avoid phrases such as these, which just kind of pad the writing out and don't really add anything new. And think about Kipling, and here's quoted here, and who said the important aspects of a story, and your paper should be able to tell a story, are what, why, when, how, where, and who, and concentrate on answering those questions. And what do I mean by simple words and short sentences? This is really what I mean. Short sentences, active voice. Avoid complicated scientific phrases. If try and keep one idea per sentence, and if you find your sentences are getting long, just cut them in 2 or cut them in 3. Try and write in an evidence-based way. Don't say that a disease is common or rare. State what the incidence or prevalence is. Don't say a diagnostic test is accurate. State what the false positive rate, or false negative rate, or positive predictive value, or whatever. Use scientific terms. Similarly, don't say that a treatment works or it doesn't work, state what the level of evidence is, how confident you are, and what the absolute risk reduction is, ideally, and number needed to treat. So describe your results in an evidence-based way, which will be unambiguous. And then you'll have written up your paper, and what should you do then? Before submitting it, make sure you review it yourself. Get your co-authors to review it and sign it off. Get some expert colleagues and maybe some non-expert colleagues to read it and give you feedback on it before you submit it to a journal, and people you don't know, i.e. peer reviewers, will be giving you feedback on it. So before you start, before you submit, it's worth getting second and third opinions and external friendly opinions who will critique your paper and make suggestions and make it better before it goes to an editor and goes for peer review. I'm going to skip this because we've touched on it already, and you should have probably decided at this stage which journal to choose. And then you need to submit it. Give yourself a little bit of time, because manuscript submission systems can take time. Get everyone's details beforehand so that you'll be able to then submit them into the system. Remember that electronic submission through manuscript submissions systems, it's hard the first time, but then the next time you go back to that journal to submit another paper, hopefully, then the system will remember you, sometimes remember your co-authors, and so lots of the fields will be pre-filled. After submitting, you got to wait and be a little bit patient. It will need to be screened, maybe seen by a senior editor or associate editor. Then if they like it, it'll need to go for peer review. They'll need to find peer reviewers, get the peer reviewers to agree, send it off for peer review, then wait for the peer reviewer to send it back, then look at the peer reviewer comments, come to a decision, etc., etc. The whole thing is not something that can be done in days. You need to wait a little while, and if you don't hear anything, then you can, after a decent period, you can make a polite inquiry, but don't. But you need to wait a little while to allow the scientific process and the peer review process to take place. And then you'll get a decision, and the decision may be yes, but it's likely that they'll have some suggestions, and try and get back to the editor as quickly as you can. The answer may be maybe, i.e. can you make major revisions? Once again, if you can, try and make those major revisions reasonably quickly, get them signed off by your team, and resubmit it. Usually you'll be given 6 or 8 weeks or something like that, and if you don't get the revisions back in that time frame, then you'll have to start again from scratch. If the answer is no, it may be worthwhile appealing if certain journals have an appeals process. I'll touch on that in a couple of slides. So understanding peer review is important, and there's different forms of peer review, from open, single, double-blind, etc., where the peer reviewer knows who you are, you know who the peer reviewer is, but sometimes you don't, and sometimes you don't know who the peer reviewer is, and the peer reviewer doesn't know who you are. Remember, the peer review advises and the editor decides. I always encourage people that once they have a level of expertise in a clinical or non-clinical subject, to volunteer to become a peer reviewer, because they'll learn a lot from the process of journals and publishing by seeing things from the other side of the fence. So I'll skip this slide, and here's the BMJ peer reviewer process. And as you can see, it's very rigorous. And here is the peer reviewer process according to Gary Larson, a light-hearted look at the peer reviewer process. And as I said, do think about whether you might volunteer to become a peer reviewer. You'll learn quite a bit through the process, and I think become a better writer and potentially a researcher as a result. And certainly, I think it will improve the clarity of your writing, and you'll learn how difficult it can be sometimes to read certain papers, and the importance of making your ideas clear so that editors and peer reviewers and ultimately readers will be able to understand the points that you're trying to get across. All the major medical journals, the high impact journals, they've got a low acceptance rates. It's difficult to get published into them. The open access journals have a higher acceptance rate. So do take that into account in deciding what paper you might go for or what journal you might go for. If rejected, what should you do? Tell all authors of the paper about the rejection and share feedback with them. Consider all the feedback that you've got from editors and reviewers, and use the comments if you can to revise and improve the paper, and then submit to the next journal. Or you can consider appealing. Some journals allow you to appeal, and there's no guarantee your appeal will be successful, but it might be worthwhile. Depending on what exactly the peer reviewers say. Sometimes the peer reviewers might not completely agree with each other, so the decision, you might think it's been a borderline decision, and under those conditions it might be worth appealing. For the BMJ, about 20% of appeals are accepted, but you only get one appeal. And lastly, and I think this is my last slide or second last slide, if rejected, don't give up. Like, all too commonly, I see people who got their paper rejected at the first journal they sent it to, and they give up and don't submit it to another journal, which is a shame. If you persist, you will find a journal that will accept your paper if you've got particularly if you've got the methodology right. Even if everything else is absolutely perfect, if the methodology is right, you should be able to get your paper published. But the thing is to keep going and not to give up. Papers will find their level, and you will find a journal that will accept your paper. And that's my last slide. If anybody wants these slides, please do get in touch. My email address is here, and happy to share and indeed answer any questions that people might have via email, or indeed now via the chat box or whatever. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, and I think we've just gone close to 35 minutes, and happy to answer any questions that anybody might have on any aspect of getting published, doing research, etc., etc.
Thank you very much, Kieran, for the overview. I think I'm just going to start with this question. Can you just clarify the concept of impact factor to our audience?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the impact factor of a journal basically relates to the number of papers that the journal publishes and the number of times those papers are cited in the biomedical literature. And the higher the impact factor, generally the higher quality the journal. And the BMJ has and New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet and JAMA have amongst the highest impact factors within medicine. Impact factor isn't absolutely everything, and you shouldn't necessarily think that, oh gosh, if my paper doesn't get published in a high impact factor journal, it's the end of the world. There are other things that are important as well, and it depends ultimately what type of paper that you've written, could it be a case report, which might be really important for people starting off in their writing and research careers, or a quality improvement report? You may not be able to get those published in a high impact journal, but you will probably be able to get them published in a journal that's indexed in PubMed, and that's high quality for the type of paper that it does publish.
Right, thank you very much. There is a question from on Zoom. I would like to ask, how does one approach trying to publish a piece that is not research/data-based, such as an opinion or a letter?
Okay, thank you. So that's an excellent question, and a letter, it's very straightforward. If you go to instructions for authors, there'll be clear instructions of how to submit a letter. On BMJ.com, being one example, they publish rapid responses, and the best rapid responses every week, they take them and they edit them and they put them in the paper journal, and they become a proper publication in their own right. The important thing about letters, I think, is to make sure you get them in a timely fashion. There's no point writing a letter 6 months after the original publication. You need to get your letter or rapid response straight into the journal as soon as you can. Usually letters have a very restricted word count, i.e. 300 or 400 words and 2 or 3 references. So you need to stick to that. And usually you can expect to get 1 or 2 points across in your letter, and that's what you should aim to achieve. There's no point in writing really long letters. It's unlikely that the journal will accept them and publish them. But once again, particularly when you're starting off in your career, letters are a perfectly acceptable publication.
Excellent. Next question is from Facebook. It says, sometimes we conduct studies which addresses more than one question. So how do we avoid being labeled as salami slicing?
Okay, so I think that generally it's through planning at the very start and saying, okay, in this research, I'm going to address this question or these questions, and to state that clearly in your protocol for the research. And then your protocol will be ultimately approved by your department, institution, and the ethics review board if it's research, the research ethics review board. And then you kind of have to stick to what you've planned to do. You got to stick to your protocol. You can get the protocol published, and ideally you should try to get it published in a journal that publishes protocols. But then you've got to stick to it, and your final paper has got to be compatible with your protocol, and that should help you to avoid salami slicing, whereby you got a research paper and you're trying to get multiple publications out of it. If you stick to what you plan to do at the very start of your research, then it shouldn't be an issue, and salami slicing research output should be avoided.
Excellent. Next question off Zoom. It reads, I'm working outside the UK. If I want to publish a review article about some condition, how can I find a co-author or a consultant to review my work and help to get it published? Do usually consultants or professors responsive and helpful in this topic?
So that's a good question. I would say that you're better off not doing something like that, but rather when you've done your research, you don't want to be deciding who the authors are then. You want to decide who the authors are well before you start. And you need to have, obviously, yourself, but also members of your department, your consultant, your senior people within your department who are going to be supervising you, and they should be co-authors. And nobody should really be doing research single-handedly on their own. They should be doing it as part of a team. Of course, it's acceptable to have authors from different institutions, and sometimes those institutions can be from different countries, but you need to plan that from the start. You shouldn't be doing research, writing it up, and then trying to find some co-authors from different countries. That's not best practice, because all authors need to satisfy the criteria for authorship, which I laid out in the slides. And if you're parachuting people in at the last minute, then they won't satisfy criteria for authorship.
Thank you. The next question is off Facebook. How do you deal with submitting a piece of work when the abstract and title of that work have been published as an abstract in a conference and in the conference journal? Does one just change the title and abstract around that?
Okay, so that's an important question. I think that in these circumstances, if you've presented your work at a conference and then you're trying to get it published in a journal, of course, that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. But what you need to do is to be transparent with the editors, and to state in your cover letter that this work has been presented at whatever conference in the past few months, etc., etc. The editor will understand that and know that this happens all the time, and should be fine, and will not or should not view that as a form of duplicate publication. So I think, like everything else, it's about kind of being clear and transparent and letting the editorial team know everything about your paper and the provenance and background of this paper.
Thank you. Can I just add in a question there about from an editor's or journal's point of view? How does an editor or a journal maintain the balance between originality and giving the junior researchers an opportunity to get their work published? For example, when would you say, well, we've published this so many times, so if you've got 300 case reports on thyroidostorm or myxedema coma, you've got somebody who had seen such a case, it's interesting with important learning points, but they have been addressed in the literature before. When would you say no?
So once again, I think it depends on the journal and the journal's policies. There's a number of journals are dedicated to case reports. There's a few of them, and competing interests. Of course, I work for BMJ, but there's a journal called BMJ Case Reports, and it's got instructions for authors. And of course, even rare or relatively rare diseases like myxedema coma or thyroid storm will have been lots of published case reports on them already. But one of the criteria for publication is, well, what are the learning points from this? And if you can get across those important educational points, then I think that significantly improves your chance of getting published. There's no guarantee with these things. And also, do think a little bit about what aspect of the case report or other type of paper might be original. And sometimes it's an unusual complication of myxedema coma, or an unusual presentation of myxedema coma, or a myxedema coma that's been treated in a certain way and a patient developed unexpected adverse events from the treatment, etc., etc. And that may be able to get important learning points across, but also show that your work is original in at least some way.
Excellent. So the last question from Zoom, if someone is unsure as to what type of piece they will write and submit, how and where can one find information on the correct type of piece to write and format?
Okay, thank you. So that's a really important and fundamental question, and something you need to decide well in advance of starting your research. And I think it comes down to, well, what exactly is your research question? Are you trying, or what exactly story are you trying to get across? Are you trying to compare the effectiveness of two drugs? Are you trying to have you done a quality improvement project and you're planning to write it up? Have you done a cohort study or whatever? The important thing is that editors expect that the paper to be written up in a format that's best for answering the particular research question. And so you need to decide well in advance. There's a range of different resources out there on the internet, including BMJ Research to Publication, where they go through all the different types of research studies and help you choose which research study is best for answering your research question. And that's something that editors will expect to see in the methodology also when writing up your paper.
Excellent. I think we've answered all the questions, and I think our time is up. Kieran, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Any final words to close the session?
Final words are to where I started, really, which I think is to do write up your paper and do submit it to a journal. You definitely won't get published unless if you don't do those things, and do think about what journal is most appropriate, particularly for people at the start of your career, and do think about something that's straightforward. Sometimes people are in post for 6 months, and it's virtually impossible to do a full meta-analysis or randomized control trial in such a short time frame. But a case report is achievable. A letter, quality improvement project, those things are achievable, and they will count then when you're applying for more senior roles, or when you want to do a research study in the future. And lastly, do look at the Equator Network. I'm honestly surprised the number of people doctors and other healthcare professionals who've not heard of the Equator Network, who've just heard of concert criteria for randomized controlled trials, and don't know that there's lots of different reporting guidelines out there, or find out too late when they're writing up their research, whereas they should really have looked at them well before they started, and so they've got everything in place before they start. Those are the big tips, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. The audience who attended the webinar on Zoom, you will receive your certificates within 2 weeks. Obviously, we'll not be able to provide certificates for everyone on Facebook, but certificates they will be emailed to you within 2 weeks, hopefully. Kieran, thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Esme. Thank you very much to everybody who came along.
Thank you.